Hey everyone, Harold Fisher here, anchor and host of the Daily Drum on WHUR. Welcome to another edition of HUR at Home on WHUR.com and all of our social media platforms. Tonight on HUR at Home, we're talking to Mary C. Curtis. She is an award-winning journalist and columnist for Roll Call. Less than 24 hours from now, Mary, a lot of history will be made in the nation's capital. Just to give you a bit of that list, the oldest president will be sworn into office. First woman of color will be vice president. It's happening in the midst of the pandemic and an unprecedented threat to our democracy. Thanks for joining the program. How do you plan on covering this event tomorrow?
Well, I'll be working for a lot of it. I would, in past years, be in Washington, D.C., which is where my office is for Roll Call, where I write the column, and then I have the podcast Equal Time with Mary C. Curtis. But this is time of COVID, and as you say, a National Guard protecting the incoming administration. So I'll be in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is my home base, appearing on the television here, and then also the local NPR affiliate, doing some coverage of it. And just as you say, talking about in so many ways that it's history. And, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and I was saying as much as we have the shadow of COVID, and plus, it would be 2 weeks to the day when there was that insurrection, that riot by pro-Trump mob on the Capitol to try to stop the counting of the vote, of the electoral vote. And we saw what happened, and every day different videos and reports are coming out of just how bad it was and how much worse it could have been. And also the reports that they are vetting the National Guard and all the police covering it because there were some members of the military and police involved in it. And they're talking about how white supremacists have, gotten into these organizations. And it's so much going on, and there's so much that's going to have to be done. And plus, the outgoing president is ending it in a dramatic and not in a good way fashion, that I do think we need to stop and just remember how big an occasion this is, how history-making an occasion it is, and for so many, how joyful it is. You have Joe Biden coming in he's tried it before, and he's going to be in the presidency. And as vice president, the first woman who is of African-American descent, South Asian descent, daughter of immigrants, first person from an HBCU in the White House. That's something else. And I know you at Howard are celebrating it.
We're excited. There's no question about it. The level of excitement that really began when Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris as his running mate, and dealing with that transition when they clashed in that first debate, and to see the evolution of that. And I think tomorrow will be the culmination of that evolution to a point. And so, yes, I think that not just from an HBCU point of view, also from a Greek standpoint. I'm a Kappa, and so there's a great deal of Greek pride with that. But I think the reality is, as a journalist, there is still a bit of consternation as to what tomorrow may bring. And for you as a columnist, what will you write? Allow me a historic reference, put pen to paper.
Well, it's interesting because we have had this discussion going on recently among many Black columnists and journalists that when the Trump administration came in, and so many people were saying, who voted for Trump? And of course, we had those stories of papers going to every diner in the Midwest to talk to a Trump voter about economic anxiety and people who didn't pay attention. And many Black journalists were saying, well, everybody kind of knew what Trump was about. When he was in New York, he made his bones. He was a birther. He questioned the citizenship of the first Black president. He and his dad made money on apartments that they were sued because they discriminated against Black people. They were sued by the Nixon Justice Department, which wasn't exactly liberal. He took out those ads about the Central Park Five, wanting them to be executed. We think it might have to, and he came down that elevator talking about Mexicans being rapists and law and order, and in his rallies were like, don't be, I'd like to punch these demonstrators in the face. Maybe it had to do with more than economic anxiety. It was about race. And then, of course, during his presidency, his reaction to Charlottesville, saying there were fine people on both sides when he's talking about neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and his reluctance to criticize any of his followers when they did anything wrong. And then I wrote a column after the election, right after the insurrection, that in December, when there was that pro-Trump rally, a group of people vandalized a Black church and they tore signs off for the movement for Black lives and burned them in the street. And, this was hearkening back to terrorism of Black churches. So as a journalist, we are now, of course, a lot of people want to hear our voices as Black journalists because some of the gatekeepers were so reluctant to call out what was in front of our eyes, not only as a Black journalist, but as a Black person. You could recognize the danger signs. And, you don't want to ever say, I told you so, but we saw in that insurrection that they were destroying journalist equipment. They had scrawled murder the media because the president had talked about the enemies of the people. So you see really democracy under siege as well, the free press under siege. I know that I am very careful because you get this response sometimes talking about, really violent imagery that mimics some of the president's own language. So I'm not saying poor me, but it's just out there. And I know from talking to other Black journalists that they get it as well as journalists in general. So I do think there's a sense as a journalist that I wish that people would talk more, and I think they're doing this, not just to the disgruntled Trump voter who believes there was fraud, which there was no fraud, but also to those Black and brown and indigenous voters who came out in great numbers, sometimes even though there were voter suppression tactics to try to close polls and purge rolls and such, and talk to them about their motivation. Because the majority of whites in this country did vote for Donald Trump. When he says, I got the majority of the vote, he's a little bit right. He got majority of the white vote. But the thing of it is people of color's vote, that counts as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when he went after said, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philly, we can't trust those voters. It was pretty clear.
Right. Yeah.
But now it's dangerous because we have, even though Joe Biden's coming in, there's a good portion of the Republican base that feels that he is not a legitimate president.
And to your point, do you believe that moving forward, let us assume that the journalists of every stripe, sans Fox News, will have a version of reporting that is pretty close to the truth sayers, if I will. Do you think it may be easier to do that moving forward? Today, for example, the President-elect Biden's choice for head of the National Intelligence Agency said there will be no room for politics if she is confirmed. And that's a pretty lofty goal considering what we've seen of late, particularly when you're talking about national intelligence. So is it possible that it will be easier for journalists to to report the truth and have people believe it if the new president says that it is so?
Well, I think you will see a change in tone and things like that White House press briefing, which became a little bit ridiculous when they wouldn't answer questions in a truthful way or be open. And they are pledging to do that. I think it's going to be a process. It'll be interesting to see because it took journalists so long in some cases, or news organizations, when the Trump administration said something that was untrue, to call it a lie because
Right.
they don't want to
Yeah.
say that. They want to say it's intent. So it'll be interesting. I'm sure that they will report the Biden administration more critically, in a sense, because it will be more transparent. It'll be interesting to see if they're much harder on him than it took a while for them to report on Trump in a tough way. It's just because the tendency is in journalism to do the both siderism, on the one hand, on the other hand. And this is what one person says, and this is what the other person says. But sometimes there is just the truth, and there is no other hand.
Mhm.
So uh, that's sort of that conflict that journalists have to. They want to report the truth, but there's a tendency to always give equal weight to both sides. And if one side is, for example, caging children on the border or separating them from their parents, you have to call that out for what it is.
Mhm.
So we will see what happens. We'll also see if there will be amnesia. You saw with Mitch McConnell today saying, Trump misled people.
Mention that. Yeah.
He kind of wants to say, he wants him in the back mirror. Like, even though so many Republicans still won't say Joe Biden won the election, the Josh Hawleys and Ted Cruz's of the world, and those majority of House Republicans who voted not to certify the election, which would have done so much more to calm people if some leaders came out and said that. But it'll be up to journalists too to not let folks forget what transpired in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that in and of itself may be a steep hill to climb when journalists are always talking about kind of what happened now
Yes.
and looking for the next story. It's going to be hard to constantly bring up what or where we were. And a lot of people, I think, in some cases, don't want that to happen. They don't want to look back because for so many, the past 4 years have been painful. But looking forward,
Mhm.
for you, you've got a book coming out, and as we were talking about offline, you mentioned that you're going to be with Anthony Scaramucci. He's contributed to your venture. Talk to me briefly about that.
Yeah,
That
I
I
have
find really
I have
fascinating.
essays. I'm working on my own projects, and I'll come back and talk about those. But I have essays in two books that's coming out. One a little bit in the future called "Covering Politics in the Age of Trump," which I am in with a lot of other journalists like Ashley Parker of the Washington Post and Mark Leibovich of the New York Times. But this next one, which is out now, is called "Now What: The Voters Have Spoken: Essays on Life After Trump." And it was kind of an immediate book with a lot of essays on what people were thinking. And the people in it are really fascinating. I have an essay, but I'll be there with Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch. He has one, and I'm going to be doing a book event with him. I'm kidding. I was just saying I probably won't have to say too much. But it'll be fascinating. But folks like Joan Walsh are in it, Dusty Baker, the former
Baseball player.
baseball manager.
Yeah.
It's kind of a mix of writers, artists, personalities, people you would know, people you wouldn't. And I talk a little bit in my essay about the history in my family was very politically oriented. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My 3 older siblings were in the civil rights movement. As far one brother was arrested twice, and my mom was an election poll worker. She actually was the judge, elections person, the precinct judge that made sure there was a Democrat and Republican at each voting site, and she was Republican. But that's when, if we talk about history, Republicans, there were also in the past a lot of Lincoln Republicans who were more moderate And you had the Republican Party with people like Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts and Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland, which is where I'm from, who were very reasonable Republicans, not the party as you see it today.
Yeah.
And she's deceased now, but she would be appalled at some of the tactics because she was such an honest, straight down the line person. But I grew up with voting as the sacred time because she was always working with the vote. And she also, to see some of the poll workers attacked as being dishonest and those crowds going there and people questioning them, that kind of, it hit me in a personal way because, as I said, I grew up in a home where it, voting was this very sacred thing. Get as many people to vote as possible, and we knew about the folks who marched so African Americans could have the right to vote. And so to see some of these suppression tactics, that's a topic on which I'm really insane about, because if you don't have money for lobbyists, if you don't have money for the influence, the thing you have is your vote.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
And so for people to try to take it away or to say you need this ID, but oops, that's not the way it's supposed to be.
Mary C. Curtis, columnist with the Roll Call, journalist. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. And
I appreciate it. And tell everybody to listen to my podcast, Equal Time. I've had William Barber on, James Clyburn, Carol Anderson, who wrote White Rage. We really mix it up.
Well, thank you so much. You just put it out there, and I'm glad that you did. Good luck tomorrow. I'm going to be down there with my producer as well, so we're going to.
Good luck to you. Stay safe.
We will.
You going to do a little shimmy to the Howard marching band?
There will be no. I am pre-shimmy. Yep, I am pre-shimmy. Let me tell you.
Yeah, well, everyone can follow me at mcurtisnc3, like you see there, and maryccurtis.com. And looking forward to being back on the Daily Drum. We always get the best phone calls from your listeners. You have some great listeners there.
Well, thank you. We most certainly do, and great guests, I might add.
Aren't you sweet?
Mary, thank you so much.
Yes, I'm sweet.
I will. I gotta pack snacks. Thank you.
You got your priorities straight.
That is it for this edition of HUR at Home. I'm Harold Fisher. And as always, I'll see you on the radio.